This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Hi, I'm Greg LeBlanc, and I'd like to welcome you to Unsiloed, the podcast where we respect no boundaries. And I'm here today with Esther Wojcicki, who is the author of this wonderful book, How to Raise Successful People. And Esther's been at Palo Alto High School for many years, heading up their kind of media arts program. I think you were the chair of the English department. You had a couple other roles there. And in addition to your formal role at Palo Alto High, you've also worked with Google Theater Academy. You have a bunch of other activities that you've been doing in your community, which maybe we'll have a chance to get into. But welcome, Esther.
Thank you so much, Greg. It's really, or should I say Professor LeBlanc?
Yeah, I don't think we need to do that.
Well, but thank you for including me and interviewing me. I'm honored.
So, one of the things that comes out in your work all the time is this idea that, there are these real similarities and commonalities between the role of the teacher and the role of the parent, and maybe even the role of the spouse, right? That there are these are things which occupy, certainly the parent and the spouse part occupy a huge amount of all of our lives. And yet, while you might go to school to learn how to be a teacher, you don't really ever go to school to learn how to be a parent, and you don't ever go to school to learn how to be a partner. Since it's so important, and since we all do it, why do we think that this is something that doesn't need any kind of formal training? And even with teaching, certainly for those of us in the university, our education is really all about the subject matter, and it's not about kind of teaching the subject matter. Why is it that we kind of assume that everybody knows how to do this?
Well, I think it's historical. For thousands of years, human beings have reproduced, and the parent generation has taken care of the new generation. And so far that worked out. And let's face it, we have billions of people on the planet, so clearly we're doing something right. Although I think you have to ask the question, are those billions of people happy, and are they productive? And are they leading lives that they want to lead? So that's where the new role of parenting comes in, because what we're trying to do now, which we weren't trying to do, I think, 100 years ago, is to really see how productive our children can be when they enter the adult world, and how happy they can also be. So happiness has become something that people are pursuing. And I would say if you go back to Charles Dickens' era, they weren't pursuing happiness. They were pursuing existence. And I think that's made a big difference.
Right. And I think even when people are taught how to do some of these things, the teaching might actually do more harm than good. I think you described, you learned how to become an educator, both at UC Berkeley and elsewhere. You've got formal training in education, and in your book, you talk about how, a lot of that training in the field of education was in many ways detrimental to your experience as a teacher. What is it that we get wrong about teaching? Like, what's the number one thing that we seem to get wrong about the role of teacher and the role of parent?
Well, I think the requirements in the 21st century are different than the requirements for the 20th century. The role of the teacher in the 20th century was to teach people to obey, to follow rules, and to read. And there was a huge number of people that, as a matter of fact, the majority of the population couldn't read. So the goal was to have everybody be literate and have some math skills. And I think we succeeded in the 20th century. That was very effective. And now in the 21st century, we want people to think. We want people to be creative and entrepreneurial. And so the established rules for the 20th century, the established way of teaching for the 20th century does not work for the 21st century. And you don't get creativity when you're teaching people to obey. And we have 12 years of doing that. And the students that are the most recognized and most successful are the ones that obey the most. And they historically are also the least creative, and they're less willing to take a risk and do something different. And I think the world has changed sufficiently thanks to our technology age that we really need to rethink what we're doing. And that's why the 21st century is different.
Yeah, well, maybe it's the 21st century hasn't arrived everywhere, and there are probably parts of the world or parts of the economy where creativity and independence of thinking might not be as rewarded as they certainly are in where we are here in Silicon Valley. But you described a pretty seminal moment in your life history when you were younger, which involved your brother David, and you when you point back to that experience, you said that was sort of the moment when you decided that you were gonna think for yourself, that you were gonna question the authority, question status quo, question the kind of accepted wisdom, that you didn't have to sort of have complete faith and trust in whatever it was that you were being told. Do you think that, maybe you can say a little bit about that experience, but also, what are the other experiences that led you to that? And do you think that because your upbringing was one that was sort of rigid in many ways, even though your mother was very, very supportive, was it about your life experiences that brought you to this perspective?
I definitely think it was my life experiences that brought me to this perspective. It was very traumatic. I was 10 years old, and my mother had listened to the advice of the doctor on how to take care of my brother, who was 18 months old, after he ingested aspirin he was playing, so we don't know how much he ingested. And the doctor told her to put him to bed and see how he is in a few hours. Well, anybody that knows anything knows that if you take a poison, you don't just wait around to see how it's going to work. You run to the hospital and pump the stomach. But she, being an immigrant and also being sort of afraid to exert her own opinion and being afraid to be different, followed what the doctor said. And unfortunately, he died as a result of that. And what that taught me as a 10-year-old was that no matter what credentials somebody had, and no matter how learned they were, that if what they said didn't make sense, don't follow it. And so I ended up being very interested in learning, but I was only interested in learning nonfiction stuff, anything nonfiction. I was also interested in math and science, and it was anything that could help me protect myself from having, some kind of a negative, dying basically. And that was really, just a few months after the tragic death of my brother, I had an experience where I was in the house with my mother, and all of a sudden we all started to faint. And I had another brother, and he fainted first. And then my mother, everybody. And so my mother said to me, lie down on the bed and wait, and I'll come and get you, when things are better. And if I would have followed her advice, I would not be here today, because it was carbon monoxide poisoning, and I just would have died. And so I remember not following her advice and literally crawling down the stairs to get out of that house. But I was already at that point, I'm not listening to anything, I'm listening to myself. But I didn't think about it it wasn't on a conscious level. It was more intuitive, instinctual. I was going to do what I thought was right because I wanted to make sure that I was going to survive. Kind of was very black and white in that case.
Yeah, and I think that this seems to have shaped your idea of education, which is to really teach kids to think for themselves, right? To teach people to think for themselves. Now, of course, in today's world, we have a problem where no one trusts any authorities, right? And that people are, inherently skeptical of expertise. It seems to me that that's not the same as really thinking for yourself, right? When you say think for yourself, it means to really use your critical faculties to evaluate things in a way that makes sense. How do you teach kids this? How do you actually get kids to think for themselves? I mean, you mentioned the philosophy of education, teach people to fish rather than give them fishes, but how does one actually put that into practice?
Well, I did that early on. I started teaching in 1984. So in 87, I got my first computers. I was a odd duck at that point also, probably the only teacher in the whole district, or maybe in the state for that matter. And one of the first things that I wanted to teach my students to do was how to search. And
wait, is this when when the principals said it was a fad?
yes,
Computers were a fad.
Yeah,
in Palo Alto.
They were a fad, and that I was don't have to worry about it. We were never going to get any more, so just fad. But and all along, I continued to refine how I teach people to search and analyze the results of a search. And then I met this guy, Dan Russell from Google. And Dan Russell was a professor at Stanford. And then he took this job at Google he was in charge of user happiness. I was like, really? Why is that? What does that mean? And turns out user happiness means that if you search, you get what you want. And then you're a happy user. And so he wrote a book called The Joy of Search, it just came out last year. But I used a lot of his ideas before he published the book. And, I just wanted kids to be able to search things, but then also analyze the result of the search, because sometimes you get stuff that is just not sensible. Practice is what I had the kids do, a lot of practice and a lot of searching, a lot of talking about it, a lot of just thinking. I also taught what were the number one there were 10 of them, propaganda techniques, how to create propaganda. And why would I teach that? Well, because if you can create it, you can recognize it and you can then avoid it. And so it was so much of that made a huge difference. Like bandwagon. I don't know if you know what the bandwagon technique is. And
no, what is it?
Bandwagon is it's usually a company that's doing it, trying to show you how great their product is and that everybody else is on the bandwagon, but you aren't.
Social proof.
Yeah.
Social proof, yeah.
And so if you want to get on the bandwagon, you better, hop on right away. But once you learn all these, you can recognize them in advertising and in stories. And I also used to teach about Fox News. I had the kids watch Fox News and pick out when they were not quoting facts, but were quoting opinion. And there's a little phrase that they all use, by the way, in case you don't know it. You should watch Fox News too, and then you can figure it out. They always say, "Some people say," and then they quote it. And so most people miss the phrase, "some people say," and they just go to what was quoted. And, and then they quote that as fact. It's like, it's not fact. It's just a lot of hearsay. So, just a lot of practice, I think, that helped my students learn to do it, and stories about why it's important to think independently.
Yeah, and in my classes, I in my data and decisions class, I teach, how to deceptive statistics, how to lie with statistics, how to lie with graphics, right? In my accounting, I teach, what were called financial shenanigans, how to kind of make it look like you're, pimp out your income statement and so forth. And I try to do that in all of my classes, because in order for you to understand how to make sense of truth and lies, you have to, learn the tricks of the liars. Now, I always worry that some of those students are going to take those tricks and, really put
Use
them
them.
into practice. You got to worry about that at a business school. But I think, you had there was a great story in your book about, when you had, the principal come by and kind of inspect your methods and how you had to kind of pull the wool over his eyes. I don't know. Are you, did you ever
that
get in trouble
story.
about this?
Well, fortunately, the book came out in 2019, and the people that were putting the pressure on me were there in 1984, 85,
Mhm.
86. So they'd all either retired or moved on somewhere else. And so they couldn't get too mad because they weren't there. But just for your listeners, just to tell them what I did, I got into trouble because I allowed my students to collaborate. And in the 1980s, collaboration was seen as cheating. Everybody had to do it themselves. And they came into my classroom and it was really noisy and the kids were collaborating and I was talking and they were like, this looks like a circus. It's chaos in here. And I was like, oh, well, maybe a little bit of chaos, yes, but they're learning. Anyway, they gave me the ultimatum. Either you make them all quiet and listen to you and no talking, or you're out the door. So I had 2 weeks to straighten out the class. And what I did, well, the first day I was kind of just depressed. I didn't know what to do. And my husband said, just quit. I told you not to teach anyway. You should be doing something else. I don't know why you're doing this. He's a professor at Stanford, right? Very helpful. So what I decided to do instead was I told my students what happened. And I said, they don't like the way that I'm conducting the class. So the next time any of the observers from the administration come in, I don't want you to say a word. Silence. Well, that was it. They were like on my side. And they're like, yeah, we really like this class. We don't want you to change. And so the next time the principal came in, they were like mute, didn't say a word the whole time. And he couldn't believe it. He's like, what did you do to them? It's like, well, I wasn't going to tell you the truth, of course. But that helped me get over that stumbling block. But the word got out in the school that my classes were lively, let's put it that way. And so, the enrollment grew. I mean, I started with 20 kids, and by 1987, I had 50 signed up. And then by year 2000, there were it was over the top. I had to start other programs. There were over 100 kids.
So it reminded me of my experience. I went to Montessori school until through third grade, and then transferred to the public school system because the public school system in my neighborhood was actually among the best in the country. It was really very top shelf and great placement and so forth. But I just remember when I entered that environment, when we were all sitting at our desks and there was a woman at the front of the room on the blackboard, and I was just stunned. I couldn't really understand why we were wasting so much time. It was kind of crazy. And so, luckily I was seated somewhere towards the back of the room. So I was able to more or less engage in independent learning, but I was that was the year, this was, I think, probably early 70s. And my mother kind of stormed into the school and created a bit of a ruckus. And so they created this, what do they call it? Gifted program. And so for some of us, we had a bit of an escape hatch. We were able to just go and basically have one hour a day that was basically Montessori school. Right.
Uh-huh.
And that kind of took the edge off. But it seems like these ideas of project-based learning, student-directed learning, learning driven by the curiosity of the student, these ideas have been around for a long time. They're not new ideas, but you still see you still don't see universal acceptance. I mean, even at the university level, we have the sage on the stage as sort of the dominant teaching method. What accounts for kind of the slow rate of adoption, should I say, in the educational system for more student-directed learning?
I would say that the main reason is, first of all, lack of trust for teachers. They think that that's why they have scripted learning. Pearson and all the major publishers have textbooks at all levels where they tell the teacher exactly what to do on every day of the school year in every subject. And so if they don't trust the teacher, then they are going to tell you what to do all the time. The second reason that I think this keeps happening is because it's much more efficient for a system to train large groups of people at the same time, provided that you force them to learn it and force them to take tests on it, then perhaps people will learn it. That's how they taught reading, and actually it worked.
Mm-hmm.
But people were motivated to learn to read because, literacy is a big deal. But today, for the Common Core state standards, the teachers are doing they're following the Common Core state standards, whether it fits that group or not. They check off every standard. I've done this, I've done that, and so it's all because of accountability and the lack of trust that I think that's what's going on. If you take a look at the countries that score the highest in the world, one being Finland, and you look at how they treat their teachers, they treat the teachers with trust and respect. They pay them a high salary, and the teacher does not have to follow a defined curriculum. They've got a goal for the year. Everybody has a goal. And how they achieve that goal is up to the teacher and the students. And that makes the education exciting. So they score the highest in the world on the PISA tests, the PISA, the International Test of Student Assessment.
But don't we also, I mean, look, there are a lot of educational systems that also produce high scoring individuals that have a very different philosophy of education, particularly in a lot of the Asian countries. They have very high test scores, and it's really much more of a rote memory, top-down form of education. So, are these test scores really the way we should be? Is there a better way to assess what we're trying to achieve with students? I mean, if we're trying to encourage creativity, we're trying to encourage independence. They typically are difficult to test, are they not?
Yes, those are very difficult to test. And actually, that's a great question, because those other countries that score the highest, Singapore, Shanghai, or China, and that's all top down, and that's all memorization. And the main things that those countries are concerned about, especially in Asia, is creativity or lack of it. And I've given talks actually in Singapore, their Department of Education, in China, and the book actually comes out in Chinese this spring. And the reason that they're interested in it is because they know their system does not encourage creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And so how can they encourage creativity? And that's what they want to do. So you're right. They do not, you cannot test for this. And so perhaps we're relying too much on tests.
Well, we can only manage what we measure, right? That's I think, so we tend to, focus on metrics that are relatively easy to capture, and generally don't trust, leaving things to the discretion. And so you mentioned trust, and at that level, it's about trusting teachers. But I think your philosophy is of education and parenting is really also built on trust, right? Trusting the child, trusting the student, and in fact, the trust is the first part of the kind of philosophy you call T.R.I.C., right? The T.R.I.C. philosophy, which has a couple other elements to it. How did you come up with this? Maybe just go through the T.R.I.C. for us, and then tell us, how did you put this together?
So I'll start with what it means. So T.R.I.C. stands for trust, or the first one letter starts for trust. T for trust, R, respect, I, independence, C, collaboration, K for kindness. And so with my parenting of my children, my idea actually early on, very early, I decided to do this. I was going to trust and respect them, and I was going to give them a lot of independence, collaborate instead of dictate, and treat them with kindness. Uh, that meant, it's kind of crazy, but even for a small child, a toddler, I gave them a lot of things to do that other people might never have done, but gave them a real sense of competence. And it was things like when they were 18 months apart, Susan, who was 18 months old, she was given duties to take care of Janet, who was a newborn, basically. And her duties were, I was always really good at figuring out what kids could actually do that made them feel like they were not just doing silly things. And I mean, one thing that Susan did is there was no baby monitor back in those days, and we have a 2-story house, and I couldn't hear from the upstairs to the downstairs. So Susan was the live baby monitor, and she took it very seriously. And I mean, that was just the beginning. They did things like fold diapers and actually help set the table. And by the time Susan was 3, Janet was 2, they made their own breakfast. I taught them how to, they didn't cook, but they poured milk, they fixed themselves cereal, they opened the refrigerator and got yogurt out. They could learn how to peel fruit. I mean, I would come downstairs. I did this for a very selfish reason, I have to admit, because when they knew how to make their own breakfast, then I got to sleep in for another hour. And so that was, oh, I loved that. And they were very proud of themselves. And they also turned on the TV. Oh, there were only 2 channels at that time, Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street. So that was it. I didn't have to worry about anything terrible. And so I'd come downstairs and they'd already eaten and they were watching TV and they were ready to take a walk or do something else.
Well, this reminds me very much of my childhood. I'm a few years older than your kids, but anyone that grew up in the 70s might recognize a bit of what you're describing. And I think, part of it is your philosophy was very intentional. I'm not sure that my mother's was as intentional, and yet it yielded similar results. I think when you describe this experience to parents today, a couple things come to mind. First of all, it's surprising you weren't arrested for one thing, because of your neglect of your children, and you can talk a bit about that. They were certainly free range. And then the other thing, and this is a kind of a troubling observation, which is that mothers today, even though they have responsibilities outside of the household, which are much greater than they were in the past. I mean, fathers as well that have work longer hours. They no longer are 9 to 5. In spite of the fact that there are these greater demands outside of the household, childcare seems to occupy a larger percentage of people's time, even with fewer children. So the amount of childcare per child has really just grown tremendously in the last 30 years. And I guess the question is this is this a good thing for kids? Is there a trade-off, or is it actually a lose-lose? The parents lose their free time, and the children are losing certain elements of important elements of character. Yeah.
I think it's the last one, Greg. It's lose-lose. The parents are losing their free time, and the kids are losing their independence. And it's over the top today, because now we have electronic devices where we can monitor our kids. We can monitor their every movement. There's an app actually that I talk about in some of my talks, but I won't tell people the name, because I realized when I was giving out that app and the name, people were signing up for it. And they wanted to monitor their kids. Mm-hmm. They can monitor them everywhere, where they go, what they watch on TV, on the computer, what they're doing on their phone. And you can imagine how that makes kids feel, not to mention the fact they confiscate the phones or they confiscate the computer. Like, I saw what you were doing, stop doing that. Or, and it's not only stop doing it, I'm removing your device. I think we need to remember that when you want to have happy, self-reliant kids, you have to give them independence. And instead of coming up with rules that you personally come up with, why don't you collaborate with them and come up with the rules? You'd be surprised at how good they are coming up with rules that work for both of you.
I think Palo Alto was famous a few years back for having a rash of teen suicides. And I think some of the numbers we look at today were, I think 1 in 4 young people seriously considered suicide during the pandemic. And I we could look at the pandemic as a potential proximate cause, but I think it kind of raises concerns about what the underlying state of psychological stability is in our young people. And I think you would probably say that this was not unpredictable. This was something which is kind of a direct result of how they've been educated, how they've been parented to some degree. But of course, at the same time, you say parents shouldn't worry so much, and then you tell us all these reasons why we should be worried about our worrying.
No, we need to stop worrying and stop over controlling the kids and give them an opportunity to be independent. So I have 10 grandchildren, and one of those, well, not only one, more than one of them, started to become addicted to games. And I thought, well, this looks like what's going on around the country. They all want to game all the time. So what we did is say to this one kid, or they all did it eventually, if you want a game, you're going to have to build your own gaming computer. I'll tell you, they did it. Not only did they do it, it turned out to be such a powerful gaming computer, could run anything. But what did I do, or what did we do by doing that? Well, they learned a lot about how to build a computer, how games are constructed. I can tell you today, they're in their teenage years, 15, and 12, and they're not gaming as much. They're doing a lot of other things. But those skills they learned in gaming and in building that computer are really useful for them now.
So, why do you suppose parents are so resistant to this idea of kind of cutting their kids loose to some degree, or giving them a structured? I mean, what you're describing actually reminds me a lot of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I mean, his writing about education was very much about creating an environment. It's not a complete free-for-all environment, but an environment where there are consequences for bad actions, but there's an enormous amount of scope for discovery. Why do parents resist this? Is this a overblown concern about fake dangers, or is it really a desire to really see one's self manifested in the lives of their children?
So there's maybe 3 reasons. One is they perceive the world as dangerous. And why do they perceive the world as dangerous? Because they read it all on social media. They see so many dangerous things. And if they don't proactively protect their child, they might be nabbed, when they go out to the mailbox to get the mail.
What's like right now? I mean, all the school closings due to COVID, I think.
Everybody is overprotective. It's just beyond, it's crazy. Overprotective. But it's because you read things might have happened in Norway, or might have happened in Finland, or Germany or something, and you're like, oh, could happen here. I need to be careful. And back when I was growing up, the news traveled slowly. It was the 1950s. There were newspapers twice a day, morning news and evening news. And if you didn't read the newspaper, you didn't even know what was going on. So parents were much more relaxed back then because they were ignorant and they didn't know as much. There probably was more crime back then, but I just don't know, to be honest. So that's one reason. I think people are just more fearful. I think the second reason is that everybody wants their kid to go to the best school out there. Everybody's very competitive. And so they think that if they don't manage their child properly, they aren't going to be able to be successful. So it's competitive, the second one. And I think we can see that in a lot of places. I mean, we saw that in this terrible scandal with the guy that was doing the tests for
Hmm.
all the famous movie stars and whatever. And this person actually was operating right here in Palo Alto, shockingly, and people were paying for it. And
So your kid's education is in some degree a status symbol. Is that
it's
part
a
of it?
status symbol. And so one of the slides that I have in this deck that I do, actually, I don't know if you saw this because I keep changing my slides all the time, is that this is not a pet show. Your child is not out there competing with other pets. This is a human being. And that's right. You have to stop competing. And it starts with toilet training. I'm not kidding. So how old is your kid? Oh, you mean he's already toilet trained? And you go home and you start beating yourself up? No, we're all different. And I said this in some of my talks too. No one ever asks you how old you were when you were toilet trained, ever. No one cares. Or, how old were you when you learned to sleep through the night? And all this competition starts early and then it intensifies. And I
So like
mean,
social comparison, I think you mentioned that you have a story in the book about, I don't know, one of the kids who didn't learn to read until fairly, or wouldn't
oh,
communicate or
it's
walk or,
my, he went,
yeah,
he didn't, there was one of my grandchildren that refused to walk. He was 18 months old, 18 months, and he wouldn't walk. And it was just by random. I used to carry him everywhere. I took him to some kind of a gym facility. I thought, well, let's see if he can crawl up and down the balls or whatever. And in the distance, he saw some kids playing basketball in the gym. I swear to God, you could have called the ambulance. I almost fainted. He got up and ran to the other side. I was like, are you kidding? I couldn't believe it. So then I brought him home, and my daughter said, don't tell me. I can't believe this is true. Because he again refused to walk at home. was
yeah.
was just a mindset of, but today he's a college student, so he's fine.
So so in many ways people are suspicious of, or concerned about differences, right? There's different learning styles. There's different degrees of development. People have different sizes and bodies and so forth. And people are concerned that they're not, up to snuff in one way or another. One of the things that struck me when I was reading your book is the similarities between the kind of teacher relationship, the parent relationship, and the employer relationship, right? So, not to suggest that the employment relationship is in loco parentis, but in a way it is, right?
It is.
We have campuses, right? Google, Facebook campuses. They're more or less kind of extensions of university campuses. Managers are really more today responsible for nurturing the growth of their employees as opposed to just, looking for obedience in their employees. The Taylorist idea of just turn that crank and I'm going to make sure you turn that crank, X number of times an hour. And if you don't, I'm going to fire you or fine you or whatever. I mean, like that kind of employee is kind of useless in today's world. So the manager is now the coach. And I think you refer to the teacher as the guide on the side. And I think managers increasingly have to look at themselves that way. And you mentioned, of course, at Google that, Google trusts its employees to manage their own time and pursue projects. Can you take your general philosophy of learning and transfer it to the employment domain?
That's a great question, and the simple answer is yes. And I've been starting to do that. Actually, I have a partner from Amsterdam, a wonderful young woman who I'm working with. It's called the TRICKmethod.com. And we just got started in December, and we're really not started yet because a lot of things have happened worldwide. But I'm trying to do that because so many companies actually have
Mm-hmm.
asked me whether I could do corporate training.
Yeah.
And I am thinking, I'm going to do it
I mean,
because
this
I
is
think they need a lot of help.
I mean, I've been teaching courses on the future of work and on kind of HR, strategic HR management for the last couple of years. And this is all the HR people that I talk to, right? First of all, HR used to be kind of a irrelevant thing within the company. Make sure everybody gets their benefits and that nobody gets, harassed. And now it's really all about like, how do we bring out the best in our employees, which is really, the job of, the parents about how do I bring out the best in my child, right? And the teacher is really all about how do I bring out the best in my student. And so
Yes.
I can see how every stage of the TRIC philosophy is manifested in the best HR practices today.
That's right. That's exactly right. And what Google did at the beginning, I was there at the beginning when Google first started, is they hired the best people they could find, and then trusted them and respected them, and gave them a lot of independence. And the philosophy in the company is collaboration. Everything's collaborative. And then, when they treated them with kindness all the time, free food, back rubs, if you don't feel well, we have a doctor on site.
Right.
You need your shoes shined, there's a guy over there that does it. But they try to treat you like a human being that they care about. And a lot of companies prior to this, I would say the 20th century companies, it was more, have you put in your time? And you clocked in and clocked out. And that there was no caring about the employee. It was caring about the productivity of the employee. And so there's a big company in Germany that just adopted this basically TRIC philosophy, Siemens.
Mm-hmm.
And it's based, since they were stuck like everyone else with pandemic, they figured that they would concentrate on the product instead of how you got to the product. And I think that makes sense. I think that makes sense for lots of companies.
Yeah, and in a previous podcast, I was talking to someone about how in some ways employers have to kind of make up for some of the shortcomings that maybe should have happened in the educational space, right? So I think in your book you talk a little bit about some conversations you had about the millennial employee, right, that everybody talks about, right, and some of the challenges that employers are faced with, when employing this. I mean, it's obviously stereotyped to some degree, but sort of the lack of difficulties with grit and resilience and the ability to fail and have disagreements and deal with feedback and so forth. It would be really great if we could make sure that people show up for their jobs, with these traits already kind of in place. How does one do that? And or maybe before they even show up at say university, because they were raised in a household like this. How do you what exactly are those attributes that you find particularly concerning about maybe today's youth or entry level employees?
So I actually did a survey of CEOs and their hiring, and actually to every single one that I interviewed, it's in the book, said that they had a pretty serious time hiring employees who were willing to take a risk of any kind, intellectual risk. The main complaint was that the employees coming out of even the best Ivy League schools were always stopping all the time to get reassurance that they were doing it right. Is this right? Am I doing a good job? Should I be doing something else? And I think this comes from a training where you are right. There has to be a right answer. And if you're not on that right path, well, then there's a problem. And creativity, as you know, when you're creative, you're vulnerable because nobody else has done it before and you're doing something different and you might look like a fool, but you're at least trying. And schools should encourage kids to take a risk so that they are not so afraid of making a mistake when they go into the corporate world. And So getting rid of this problem is something that I think at this point, that's part of what I would be talking about in corporate training is how to empower your youngest employees, your most recent employees, because I think they're all coming out with that fear of making a mistake.
Yeah, it's funny. I was at an event a couple of years back at I think it was at the New York Fed, and it was there were all the deans, a lot of the deans of the top business schools, and some professors, and a lot of the kind of leading the leaders of a lot of the top investment banks, and so we were talking over lunch and dinner and so forth, and the issue of recruitment came up, and what was interesting was that all the people at the big banks, they said, oh, this is what we're looking for in our employees, and we have such a heck of a time finding it. And the professors were all like, yeah, those are the things that we want our students to have. And we have, such a hard time, instilling them. And when we dug deeper, what we discovered was that the recruiters for these institutions, they weren't looking for those attributes. And then when we dug on the other side, we realized that the career management and recruitment people on our side weren't, they weren't encouraging those attributes. So it was almost like the recruiters and the placement people, they had their own little conversation about what they thought was important, but the kind of the deans and the managers had a completely different notion of what was important. And I think a lot of it came back down to just like what's measurable. Like, so, GPA is measurable, and performance in a structured interview is measurable, and test scores and majors and that sort of thing are measurable. So I think we're going to have to come up with kind of better ways of really, measuring these things in order to get real change.
I think assessment has to change. That's right. And the other thing that I realized in all the years I was teaching is that some of the most talented students that I had were late developers. And so they came into my class, and there was primarily boys for some reason. But, they would do their homework and couldn't find it in their backpack, or they would forget their backpack, or just all kinds of crazy disorganized stuff. They were having a lot of trouble. And it wasn't just my class, it was across the curriculum. But I realized that when you give them an opportunity to believe in themselves and let them have some control of what they're doing, it's dramatic. I mean, these kids become amazing students. And by the time that they were, 12th grade, they were outstanding. But then again, the other thing that bothered me was some of these kids did poorly, C's and D's in ninth grade. And by the time they were juniors and seniors, they were doing really well, got A's. They averaged those grades, for college. And so I was like, I was always writing letters, discount his first and second year of high school. Let's just look at junior and senior year. So we need to revise the way that we evaluate kids. And, it's just not fair.
Allowing for some exploration, allowing for development. You mentioned when you were in college, you worked as a house cleaner, and
that's right.
I think I've had some odd jobs myself, and I think your kids all had kind of some odd jobs. That's at least at the very highest, high, income groups and high achieving groups to come to the elite universities. It's kind of increasingly rare to find that kind of experience. What can that type of experience do for you? How does that help as a learner?
Well, I think that it gives you a lot of grit, and it also it makes you appreciate a lot of things, the value of money, the value of your possessions. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but I still have clothing that is like I bought when I was in college because everything was so valuable to me. Since I didn't have any money, I always took care of everything. And I see today a lot of kids don't do that. They don't recognize the value of hard work. And also, it gave me the perspective, I know what it's like to be a house cleaner. So, and I actually know what it's like to be a waitress. And so I appreciate those people and I appreciate what they contribute.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it would be great if more kids had that opportunity. We have to stop giving our kids so much stuff. I think one of the things this idea I came up with, I think it was after I wrote the book, that, all these parents, they pay these huge tuitions for their kids. And the kid never sees the money going back and forth between the parent and the university. So my idea is, parent, have the kids write the check. Just write the check. They don't sign it, but they write it. But just paying, I don't know, $25,000 to school, and you know how much money is going into that, or 50, somehow it changes your perspective. And maybe you pay more attention to the sacrifice that your parents are making for you to be able to go to an elite university or a college anywhere. So
yeah, one of your sorry.
No,
One of the letters in T.R.I.C. is collaboration, and I think you talked about how important it is to have kind of collaborative activities with your children and with your students. And you mentioned the vacation planning is a great example. And when I read that, I thought, wow, I remember when I planned my family's trip to California when I was in 6th grade. We came on out to California and went up and down the state, and I went through got the AAA trip pack, and we went to Sequoia National Park and Disneyland and all that stuff. I really like that. And the other thing I think you mentioned is this idea that parents have to really lead by example and show that the best way for people to learn is through leadership, through observation, and this is true I think in the corporate world as well, right? If the leadership's not kind of walking the walk, then it's very difficult for anybody to kind of learn that. And you rattled off, I think, 10 kind of. I love the checklist. It's a checklist where I think it's certainly not exhaustive, but certain kind of character traits and virtues and behaviors that you thought would be super helpful for children to have imprinted on them by their parents. How did you come up with that list? I mean, was this a formal list that you had?
This is, here's my book, of course.
This was like, punctuality and presentation and neatness and how do you deal with food? How do you deal with strangers? How do you are you honest? That kind of stuff. Are you kind?
All those things are model. Your kids follow you. So if you're punctual, they're punctual. If whatever matters to you matters to them. And so a lot of parents will say, do as I do, or no, do as I say.
Do as I say, right?
Don't do as I do. And I think that's the number one problem that I see going on there, and it unfortunately happens with electronic usage. Don't use your phone at dinner. Be respectful. And then the parents do it.
Yeah, I thought your point on technology was particularly relevant in today's world, especially given where we live, right? And we all know Steve Jobs famously restricted his kids' usage of Apple products, and you talk a lot about kind of partial attention. Could you, if someone did not have the opportunity to read your book and you wanted to give them some guidance on the dangers of tech in kids' household, what would, and also I think in the classroom, how would you summarize this? How could you devise a good policy? And I think part of it is that the policy has to be developed by the kids themselves. We have it at Berkeley in our MBA program. The students themselves came up with a no electronics policy in the classroom, And I think there's no way that we as professors could create and impose a policy like that. I mean, as a professor, if you stand up and say, all right, I don't want to see anybody with their cell phones in class, like it would never work. And we don't even try it with the executive MBAs, but with the full-time MBAs, they themselves kind of designed this policy, and then they kind of call each other out for violations of it.
I think that that's exactly the way it has to work. It has to be collaborative. They have to come up with the policy, because if you come up with the policy, then you're always a policeman in the classroom or at home. And so they have to understand the why behind it. And most parents don't explain the why. They just like, I'm telling you to do it and you're going to do it. And that works against the student or against the kid and against the teacher. And it also works against the manager. You know, people need to feel respected and they need to understand why. So in my classes, the tech policy was always a collaborative policy. What do you think and how do you think tech should be used? What should we do with phones? And, you know, if you don't think we should be allowing phones in the classroom, let's vote on that and make that a policy. And it was, every class had their own policy. But for the most part, I can tell you that they did not allow technology in the classroom. They would, if you were talking or other people were talking, they wanted you to pay attention. And you cannot, even in spite of what everybody says, you cannot multitask. You cannot pay attention and then, you know, not pay attention.
But is there something particularly kind of dangerous about technology as opposed to, I mean, look, when I was a kid, I was just, you know, I was walking around with a book the whole time, and you know, my parents would have to force me to put the book down to eat dinner, you know, and I'd be walking down the street like this, and I'd be stumbling over the curb, and you know, I mean,
I was the same way.
Is that any better than you know, walking around with my phone?
I think it is better than walking around with your phone, because on your phone, you're watching basically what other people are doing on Instagram. You're watching crazy videos. You're watching TikTok. You're watching things that really don't amount to much in the way of any kind of edification. You're not learning anything. It's just a watch me world. Watch me do crazy things. And so
if your kids were reading long form journalism on their phone, it would be different.
Actually, that is true. If they're reading a book on their phone or they're reading something else on their phone, then it's different. But you know, I explain this to the kids, you know, so it's not like it's a big secret. Show me what you're doing, and now, you know, I can see you're doing something really silly. You know, there are teacher products out there, and I won't name them. I don't want to embarrass them, but they enable the teacher to watch what every kid is doing on their computer at every minute of the class period. Mm-hmm. And you can just run over to a student and say, I saw that you checked your Facebook page. You know, I personally think this is terrible. You know, it's an invasion of a student's privacy. And if he wants to check his Facebook page, well, maybe there was some important message coming that he wanted to check. I don't agree with any of that over monitoring that is going on.
So I think in addition to being a teacher and a parent, I think of you as a journalist in a way. And even though your journal doesn't have the circulation of a New York Times, right? The Campanile has a much smaller footprint, but you know, you are the titular owner of this. You're the Rupert Murdoch of the local high school, you know, journal. And I remember when I was in second grade, I had a mimeograph machine down in the Montessori school, and I would, you know, make the newspaper for the class. What skills do you think does the instruction in journalism, right? The way in which you do it, what special insight do you think they're getting from that? Or would they get the same insight if you had them managing any kind of enterprise? So part of it's about having this student-run organization where they're responsible and held accountable for what it is they're doing. But part of it is that what they're doing is journalism. Is the journalistic education helping them to better understand the difference between, say, fact and inference and normative and positive, and those kind of critical thinking skills that we often always wish that people had more of.
It actually is doing exactly what you say. Fact and inference. Fact, the shocking thing is most people in this country can't distinguish between fact and opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but first of all, they learn all the social media skills for life by doing it.
So Chronicle, does the Campanile have a Twitter presence and
Yes,
an
Twitter.
Instagram presence now?
Yes, the Campanile does, but in addition, there's 10 other publications, newspaper, they're all magazines or websites or other things, and they all have Twitter, Facebook, Instagram presence. They learn how to manage social media. They know the power of social media. And also by being able to write a story, you can understand when you read a story, you can see what you're looking for in that story. Like, are those credible sources? Are there sources at all? What kind of a story is this? And even if it's an opinion story, is it properly documented? A feature story. Feature's not supposed to have opinion in it either. Why is there so much opinion in this feature story? I think every student in this country should have a journalism program for at least one semester so that they become literate in the social media, and they should learn about all the different social medias of opportunities, if you want to call it, or programs out there.
Because we're all journalists now, right?
We're
Every
all
one of us is a
journalists. We're
journalist.
citizen journalism. We're all
Yeah.
writing. We're all tweeting. We're all on LinkedIn or Instagram, there's so many products out there, and kids need to know what it's all about. And they don't teach it anywhere in the school, nowhere.
Right.
And they should. And why not? Isn't that what the school is supposed to do? Prepare you for the real world? Well, why aren't we teaching any of this? Instead, we confiscate kids' phones and put them in phone hotels, and then they pick them up at the end of the day at 3:00. So I think that we need to change our policy in what we teach.
So I want to end with the final letter in think, right, which is kindness. And I think you end your book also with the discussion of the importance of kindness, and you talk about purpose, and I think purpose is related to community, which is related to kindness. Is kindness actually something that you can teach? I think most of us, when we talk, the fundamental attribution error that we all succumb to, which is that there are kind people and not so kind people. Is kindness a characteristic that you can teach, and is it really the role and responsibility of the teacher to teach this, or is this really exclusively the domain of the parent?
Well, so I personally think you can teach kindness, and not only that, I think it's really important in our world to teach people to be kind, have compassion and empathy. I think it starts at home, and all parents hopefully are teaching this, but some parents are not. You teach it by modeling it. You teach it by treating your children with kindness, by understanding their frustrations, by being compassionate and empathetic. And one thing that I think is, again, really important is to carry this through to the school. So the school and the school, teacher, parent, all should be working together. And in many cases, they are. The majority of students in America, I think, were exposed to a curriculum that involved kindness and so being accepting of each other. But there are some, as we can see from looking around, that did not experience this and who are angry. But if you look at all the people who are really angry adults doing really scary things, they had really bad childhoods. And I think it's historic. You can just take a look and see what's going on. So yes, you can teach kindness, and you can teach it by being kind and by talking about the importance of kindness. There is nothing that makes you happier as a teacher than to see a child succeed. And that really is kindness. And that's what all teachers enter the profession with, that goal. And then somehow they get lost in all the rules and regulations and pressures and so forth. But that is really what it's all about.
Right. And I think in your book, you describe a couple scenarios where you were able to help some people that had come in with anger, with difficult backgrounds, and were able to help them turn that around to some degree.
I am mentoring somebody right now, an adult, who's experienced a very, I guess you would say, troubling childhood where he was teased all the time. And he was one of these kids who was not very athletic. And they line up all the kids and like who wants to be on whose team. And he was always the last kid chosen, and he was always ridiculed. And those things stick with you for life. It's really sad. Anyway, anybody can be helped, in my view, as long as they find a mentor or somebody who can really support them and believe in them. I think it can make a big difference. And every human life is valuable. We want to help those people live to their full potential.
Well, last question, because this is all. I'm very inspired by this. The question is, with the move to online education, right? So most of the training you've done and teaching you've done in your life has been in the bricks and mortar setting, where you can develop good relationships with kids face to face. Do you think that online education is limiting in your ability to do that? I mean, most of the country right now, most of the kids in this country are at home, being taught remotely, and they usually have their parents sitting around being responsible in part for what they're learning. How does this open up new possibilities? Can we, if there are good teachers, maybe these good teachers can have a bigger footprint and a bigger reach, or is it that the effectiveness of the teacher is going to be inherently reduced by this lack of interaction?
I do think that, unfortunately, it's the latter. I think that the teachers are still trying to follow the curriculum. They're still trying to do what the administration tells them to do. And as a result, these are large groups of kids on a Zoom call, not being able to interact with each other, that are sitting there listening to the teacher talk. I would say that's at least 50% of what's going on today. Maybe the other 50% is better, but I haven't seen a lot of evidence to that effect. I retired in June because of this pandemic. I just saw it coming. And also I'd been teaching. I was thinking of retiring anyway. But what I did last spring, when we had to stay home, is I changed the way this Zoom call was structured. And the program is doing that now. There's about 700 kids taking journalism at that Palo Alto High School, and all the other teachers are following this model. We put the kids in charge of the Zoom calls much of the time. And we allow a lot of these sort of 2 and 3 group, 2 to 3 students in a group, going off on side visits, or Zoom has these rooms that you can go into. So if the kids are working on the project together and they're interacting with each other together in a small group, then it's fine, because then they can do things and plan things that they want to do. But if it's a teacher talking to 30 kids at once for an hour, it is ineffective. And I mean, I think adults need to stop and ask themselves how effective that would be for them, and why are they having kids do that? So I want to sympathize with teachers, though, because I realize that they are put in this position of being told to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's a tough world.
So
And
the sage on the stage method might scale just fine because it wasn't super effective to begin with, but the more personalized forms of education may or may not scale quite so easily.
they don't scale as easily, but I think it's better for a kid to interact with 3 or 4 kids and the teacher once a week
Mm-hmm.
on a personal level than it is to interact with a big group every day.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been fascinating. I enjoyed you coming and speaking with me today and with people out there who are going to listen to this podcast. So everybody, remember How to Raise Successful People. Check it out. There's also the other book, Moonshots in Education, which I think is out of print, but you can track it down somewhere on Amazon.
Yeah, it's a little expensive, but yeah, I'm thinking about setting it, revising it, and printing it again.
And stay tuned for more from Esther. Okay, so I'll see you again. Nice chatting.
This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.